started already? Good afternoon. Buenas tardes. I am Connie Martinez. Along with Monica Negron, we are the co-chairs of the Hispanic, Latino, and Faculty Staff Association at the University of Louisville. We welcome you to our event celebrating the Hispanic Heritage Month. And before I pass the microphone to the Dr. Jose Fernandez, let me tell you a little bit about the Hispanic Latino Faculty and Staff Association, HLFSA. The HLFSA began operating in 2011 and has become an employee resource group that promotes, support, celebrate, and try to explain to the community the diversity and complexity of our Latinx culture within the university and our community. And once again, we want to thank you for being with us and spending this afternoon. And now I'm going to pass the microphone to our prestigious Dr. Jose Fernandez.
Good evening, everyone. Today I have the great pleasure of introducing our Hispanic Heritage Month speaker, Dr. Mark Hugo Lopez, who is the Director of Global Migration and Demography Research at the Pew Research Center. He previously held the title of Director of Hispanic Research at the Pew Research Center. Dr. Lopez has authored and co-authored numerous reports on the attitudes and opinions of Latinos on various topics such as education, migration and immigration, identity, civic engagement, and voter participation. He graduated from Princeton University with a PhD in economics. Dr. Lopez is a founding member and former president of the American Society of Hispanic Economists, as well as a former member of the American Economic Association Committee on the Status of Minority Groups in the Economic Profession. He has been featured in numerous media outlets, including the Washington Journal, C-SPAN, USA Today, and most recently in the HBO documentary Habla Now. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Mark Hugo Lopez and Marcos Morales.
Wow, Jose, thank you for the wonderful introduction, and it is really wonderful to be here today. I appreciate very much the invitation to get to talk with you about some of the work that we do at the Pew Research Center and some of the trends that we're tracking, and of course this year's election. So Marcos, I look forward to our conversation and ready to get started when you are.
Yes, Dr. Lopez, thank you so much for being here with us. And you all can hear me, right? Okay. Just wanted to make sure I was off mute here. So yes, thank you so much for joining us. I myself here. So for those who don't know me, my name is Marcos Morales, and I'm the program coordinator of the Hispanic Latinx initiatives here at the University of Louisville. And I'm, yeah, like I mentioned, you know, I'm really thrilled to be here in celebrating Hispanic Heritage Month. And then just like hearing your intro, I know it's just exciting to be sitting with somebody like you and to have this conversation, which is such a really pertinent conversation to have right now, right? As the elections are right around the corner. And so before we dive into anything though, I know that we're all on Zoom and we're all sitting at home. So I would first want to invite all of us to come off mute and say, and when I count to 3, we're going to say hola or hi or however y'all, let's do one big hola in the room, okay? Just to kind of bring everybody in the room and to at least do a little, have somewhat of togetherness in our time here together. So if you all could just hit that unmute button, and on the count of 3, we are all going to say hola, okay? So get your little mouse ready. So 1, 2, 3.
Hola. Hola. Hola.
Hola.
Hola. Hola.
Thank you all so much. Thank you all so much.
I love that, Marcos. That's a really great idea. I'm going to use that with my staff.
Hey, we got to do something out here to kind of bring us all in, you know, a little something. You know, we got to take what we can get in this virtual world out here. But so now onto our conversation here, Dr. Lopez. So, you know, we know your name, your position. One question that I have for you as we open up and kind of get to know you and your work I would like to first start with a question that's a little bit, just a bit personal, but I think this kind of will help to kind of allow people to really get to know where you're coming from with this work. So, so the question is, who are your people? And who are your people can be very broad, right? It can be, for example, for me, my people are from Louisville, Kentucky. My people are Mexican. My people are farmers. My people are handymen. My people clean houses. My people speak broken Spanish, etc. Right? So yeah, I just wanted to open that up for you.
So who are my people? Chicanos,
Yes.
Los Angelinos, or Angelinos, which is where I'm from. Also, I would say, though, Jeep owners. I'm not sure if you've ever noticed there's a community of Jeep owners who wave at each other when they pass each other on the road.
I've seen that. I have noticed that. Yes.
And the community of Camaro owners as well. They don't wave at each other, but we race other people. And I would also say the community of scholars in the economics profession, like Jose, who are focused on Latinos and raising the profile of Latinos in the economics community. And I'd also say the community of scholars nationwide who are in the same space that I am, have a lot of really great colleagues in every field you can imagine who really help to make the stories that we tell at Pew Research better because of the work that they do.
100%. Thank you for that. Okay.
Oh, I forgot to say, I should say Mexican-American. Sometimes, though, it depends on where I am. If I'm in Texas, I'll say I'm Hispanic. If I'm in California, I'm Latino. If I'm speaking Washington, D.C., I'm Latinx. Depends.
He's good. He's good. Yes, yes, yes. Fluid, totally fluid in between all of those, huh? Yes, yes, yes. Ni de aquí, ni de allá type of thing. Yes, I'm this and that. I love it. And so I really love that part about your thing. And so tell me, what has been your experience with voting, Dr. Lopez? And so from, I'm curious to know, I know, and this question is coming from, somebody who's first generation Latinx here, who honestly, I've been eligible for 2 elections, and I honestly, in full truth, full disclosure, I think I only know that I participated in the other one. I don't know that I participated in 2013. And, I think that speaks, coming from a very first generation where we're really skeptical about government, period, so I'm wondering for you, what brought you to this work and what's been your experience with voting?
So I'd come to this work after many, many years of doing a lot of research on young Americans and young Latinos particularly, though, and their civic engagement. I'm going to come back to that, though, because my interest in public policy in the state of Latino America, of how Chicanos are doing generally, comes from many years of being in Southern California and in a family that was very involved in many ways in the community where I grew up. My father, for example, was involved in the local Chicano movement in the 1970s. And I remember when he ran for political office and then he got recalled and lost the recall election, that was really something that it really got me thinking about what is the role of public policy in shaping the lives and outcomes of people like Chicanos in Southern California. Now, I don't think I could have articulated it like that back then, but I had always had an interest in following the news, listening to the radio, to particular radio stations that I was always into and listened to all the time when I was a kid, to thinking about the different types of books that I would read as a high school student and so forth. So this was always a part of my upbringing and things that I was always doing. When I came to the University of Maryland, I had a chance to become the research director of a center that studied civic engagement. And I really then got to put my research chops towards work on studying how people get involved in their communities and to look at the many different ways that people do that, because voting is just one of many ways that people get involved. But in the case of Latinos, some of the grants that I helped to, that I were part of the grants program that I was managing, that I encouraged or recommended for an award, looked at how to get young Latinos particularly out to vote. And the message there that I think is important to take away from this is it really matters if you just ask somebody to vote. You don't have to be partisan. You just got to go knock on the door and say, it's really important you get out and vote today, or it's really important that you register. Let me help you figure out how to do that. But it doesn't have to be partisan. But in randomized trials, that turns out to have a huge impact. Even in something like a school board election, which tends to have very low turnout, it can almost double Latino youth voter participation if you just ask. And so that's what sort of brought me to this work and some of the big findings, at least in research I was associated with around getting involved and engagement.
Yeah, gotcha. Excellent. Okay. So now framing more of the picture of, the Latinx vote. And I know, I think it's about, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I know you got the numbers down pat, but it's about 32 million Latinx folk who can vote in this upcoming election, right? And so could you frame the stage a bit more as terms of what when we say Latinx voting, kind of paint that landscape for us. What is present currently?
So this year we estimate that, and it looks like the most recent CPS data shows this, by the way, that 32 million Latinos nationwide are at least 18 years of age and a U.S. citizen. That means they're eligible to vote. But that doesn't mean that they're going to necessarily register and ultimately turn out to vote. And historically, the Latino vote has grown rapidly in potential. So there's a record number who are eligible to vote, 4 million more, for example, than in 2016. And I'll come back to what's driving that increase in a little bit. But when you look at voter turnout rates, the voter turnout rate among that pool of eligible voters has generally been flat and oftentimes been below 50%. So in 2016, 47.5% of the then 27 million Latinos, 27.3 million Latinos, turned out to vote. That was down from 48% in 2012 and 49.5% in 2008. So we've actually been seeing a declining share of Latinos who can vote actually turning out to vote. And if you think about that, that's striking because that means that more than half of the population that could vote doesn't turn out to vote. Now, where is this growth in the number who are eligible coming from? It's largely coming from young U.S.-born Hispanics who are coming of age, who enter adulthood. So this is a part of the challenge, I think, for the Latino vote. Why that low voter turnout rate? There's a number of reasons. One key one is there are many first-time voters. And young Latinos oftentimes, as I said earlier, sometimes might need to be guided. In fact, any young person might need to be guided about where you go register and how you go vote. And keep in mind, voting isn't necessarily at the top of mind of everybody. Not everybody thinks about it every day like I do. But you will find that many young Latinos do want to get involved. They may not just know how to do so. So that may be one of the reasons why we have a somewhat lower voter turnout rate. A couple of other big reasons. Many Latinos don't live in key states. Florida is unique because Florida has a significant number of Latino eligible voters, but half of that 32 million are in just two places, California and Texas. California is not a battleground, and Texas maybe not, but if it's not a battleground state, candidates don't come and talk to people, and also you don't get a lot of effort from foundations and nonpartisan groups to get out the vote because people know how that state's going to go. So Latinos have traditionally been in places that haven't mattered as much, with the exception, big exception, of course, being Florida. A new part of the story this year is Arizona, which is appearing to be a battleground. And in both Arizona and Florida, Latinos make up about 1 in 5, maybe 1 in 4 eligible voters in those states. Now, to give you by comparison, we take a look at, say, for example, Kentucky. You only have about 1.7% of eligible voters in Kentucky being Latino. But in Florida, it's 20%. So that gives you some sense of how big the difference can be across the country. Another reason why Latinos generally don't turn out to vote as much is that they're just not getting the attention from the news media or so forth in places where many Latinos are located. And again, it comes back to this asking somebody to get involved matters a lot. But that's sort of a big picture number story for the Latino vote. There's much more to talk about, though, because I think Latino vote is a misnomer. And one of the questions that I keep getting this year is the question of, is there even such a thing as a Latino vote? I'm not so sure that there is.
Interesting. Okay. I see. Man, yeah, that's a okay. The fact that there may not be. Okay.
And the reason why I say that is because it is a diverse group. And if you take a look at the story of Latino voters in the U.S., there are many different stories. There isn't a single story. I just saw the question pop up about Cubans in Florida. So among eligible voters in Florida who are Latino, about 30% are Cuban. So Cubans are one of the larger groups. There's about 30% are also Puerto Rican. So those are the two largest groups in the state of Florida. But Mexicans aren't the top group in Florida, whereas in California, they are, for example. There are many other dimensions to the diversity of the Latino vote. For example, Venezuelans seem very focused on issues related to foreign policy towards Venezuela. And they are, by the way, very strong in their support for Donald Trump. About 3/4 say they're going to support Donald Trump in Florida. Cubans, as you know, have long had a story of tight connection to the Republican Party, but that's because Republicans have done a lot to shape policy towards Cuba that many Cuban Americans want to see put in place, particularly an embargo, for example. But the diversity of the Latino vote suggests to me that it is hard to talk about it as a single monolithic group, that instead it is a very diverse group with very diverse points of view. One last thing I'd say about this is that when we talk about the Latino population or Latino community, you'll hear me try to avoid using the word community because community implies a common viewpoint and a common sense of policies that matter on politics, etc. But the population is so diverse that I don't think that there is a single set of characteristics that define it well. And so to call it a community is perhaps not the best way to describe it. It's really a population that happens to have some common roots in Latin America.
Man, a really interesting picture you're painting here because it's quite it's really highlighting the multi-layeredness and of the Latinx, Chicano, Hispanic, a lived experience here in the United States. So quite the it's quite the picture. And so tell me, my next thing is, so what, and you've spoken a little bit about this, I'm guessing with this question, just anything that you would want to highlight with this. So what should people know about the Latinx vote? I think you like I said, you've done this maybe, or is there any statistic that you want to highlight? Like I said, I know you just kind of really told us about it, but is there anything you want to like revisit or highlight?
Yeah, there's a couple of things to highlight. The first I would say is the relative importance of youth. When we talk about Latino youth and young Latinos among eligible voters, did you know that more than half of Latino eligible voters, more than half of the 32 million, are millennials or younger? Now, millennials are getting a little long in the tooth. They're the highest, the top of the age range is 37. But think about that. A significant portion, the majority of the Latino vote is either 37, you could say 35 or younger. And that is very different for whites. The white population is kind of the flip in that it's mostly an older voter population. So as we think about the future of the nation's electorate, you'll see Latinos playing a bigger role. And even though earlier I said, fewer than half turn out to vote, with so much population growth now being reflected in growth in the number who can potentially participate in elections, you have a record turnout of Latinos every election cycle. In 2016, there were more than 12 million that voted, but that was up from about 9.7 million in 2008. So the number keeps going up. And one other thing this year that's unique about this year for Latinos is that this is the first time that there are potentially more Latino voters than Black American voters. So the Black electorate has long been the second largest in the country, but as of this year in presidential elections, Latinos are now the second largest among eligible voters. Remains to be seen how many will turn out, but you can imagine that in just a few election cycles, Latinos may surpass Black Americans even in terms of the number of voters that they have.
Gotcha. And what do you think? What are some of the strategies that you see to close this gap of Latinx voters? What are some things that I know you've spoken about that every election year it's kind of gone down. What do you feel are some strategies that for example, myself in the obviously encouraging voting, but what else? What else do you see?
Well, Marcos, you need to give me your phone number so I can call you on election day to make sure that you voted. So I will call you myself personally to make sure that you turn out to vote. But that's an example of something that can be done, that anybody can do. And to tell you the truth, this is what I do with my nieces and nephews, who oftentimes say that they don't have the time to vote, even though they know what their uncle does. But I, on the morning of, I text everybody and say, you're going to come out to vote today, right? Or have you already voted? And I'll get a lot of moans and groans, but at least they're aware of it and they're thinking about it.
Yeah.
But that talking to somebody is what's going to make a difference. And if you want to think about it on a personal basis, you could do what I do. Or if you want to think about it in terms of the ways in which, say, candidates could do something about this, it's important that candidates reach out to the Latino population and say, hey, you need to get out to vote and support candidate X, Y, or Z. I just heard today on a talk I was on earlier that the Biden campaign has started to do some very tailored and directed messaging directed at Latinos. So for example, Dominicans for Biden, Mexicanos for Biden, and focusing it in different parts of the country depending on the origin group that's in that location. Mm-hmm. That is very different than just having a very broad message that's directed at Latinos, and people will oftentimes say, the best way to reach the Hispanic vote in Spanish on Univision. But most U.S. Latino registered voters are not immigrants, not even the children of immigrants. Many speak only English, so you don't reach all of them that way. But many organizations do a lot of focus to get out the Latino vote, and that's really the way to do this, is you have to knock on doors. It's going to take shoe leather. You got to talk to people to really make it happen.
Man, I can't snap my fingers or just retweet that enough, because even from my end, I'll say here in Louisville, Kentucky, where the college-going culture for Latinx students isn't very strong, that is still very in its infant stages. And I know, I can see how critical that one-on-one, like for example, last year we did phone calls to our students one-on-one. We had our student leaders sit down and call our students to attend the Latinx student welcome that we did. And man, it was a record turnout. We had, the room was overflowing. And so, I mean, I can definitely see that how this the idea of this person-to-person contact, they call it a IRL, right? In real life contact, I think really brings, especially with such a new experience, and I mean, if you think about it too, back home, it's always like when we talk about our communities, it's always like, ve acá a la esquina, she's going to give you some milk, or ve acá, pídele a tu tía, or yo conozco un sobador over here, and it's word of mouth where our communities, it's still very oral, I guess is what I'm getting at, right?
And very in person. But you hit on something that I think is really interesting, that having been a former professor, because I was a professor for 13 years before I came to the Pew Research Center. And for me, it was always important to do the same thing that we're talking about for getting out the vote, to even just doing it to help Latino students navigate university, whether that be graduate school in the case of my work or undergraduate experiences. I found that it helps to just ask, hey, do you want to get together for lunch to talk about how things are going? I'm happy to be to talk about that. And I find that even today, there are many folks around the country who I reach out to who may have been on a panel with me, and I'll follow up and I'll ask how things are going and so forth, and offer to be a resource. But having those moments to connect is where you see a lot of gains made, and that's true about voting. But I think it's even true about mentorship of young Latinos and Latinas at the university level as well.
Gotcha. And so now continuing on to the topic of when we talk about Latinx youth specifically, what words do you have for the Latinx youth? Maybe they're either listening here or they'll listen here in the future when we share this recording.
It's important that you express your opinions and that you express your viewpoints. And that's true either through voting, but it could be true in many other ways as well. For example, we see many young Latinos have over the last few years have engaged in protest. And protest is actually a voice, a way of getting civically involved and expressing your voice that may be different than voting, but it matters too. And the one thing I would ask is there's an opportunity to do something. You can change the world. It's up to you to do that, even no matter how hard it seems and you want to give up sometimes. but I do think that it's important to express your voice, whether that be through voting, whether that be through going out to protest, maybe even writing a letter to your congressman or woman, or writing to the newspaper. The important thing to do is to get involved in some way, and there are many ways to do that. But if you have a concern about where things are going in your community, then it's important that you express your voice to shape the community.
Mm-hmm. And what words do you have for the youth that are either undocumented or documented? Anything? What do they have a role? If so, what does that look like? Or
Absolutely. In fact, I think the role of Dreamers has been so evident in how important they have been to both raise their own voices for their own situation, but to raise the voices of the Hispanic population in the country, because they have gotten out there, protested, stood up, wrote letters to the editor, did opinion pieces. In other words, they engaged with their voice in a very civic way. That's what I think anybody can do. And it's important that you do that no matter what your legal status is, you can still make a difference. Yes, I understand that perhaps the environment may not be so conducive to it now, and it takes a lot of courage to do. But one doesn't necessarily always have to protest. There are many other ways to get involved. But I encourage anybody to think about how they can reshape their community. That is done by getting involved in that community.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And yes, I think, let me see. My next question is, and then we'll open it up here to the floor for any questions that we might have in the room. My last question to you is, what is something that you've come across in terms of in relation to the Latinx vote that was really eye-opening or just kind of made your jaw drop, like anything that was just like, wow, that's and this can be true for, I'm talking in your whole career. What was like something that was just like, whoa, like?
So it's hard to say, partly because the work that we do at Pew Research, we've been tracking this for so long that a lot of what we see are trends we've been seeing for a while. So for example, back in 2008 or 2012, 2008, 12, and then 16, we were already seeing Latino voters support Republican presidential candidates at a level of about 25 to 28%.
Say that one more time. I missed it.
So when you take a look at the way Latinos voted in 2008, 2012, and 2016, so even before President Trump was running, we were already seeing Latino support for Republican presidential candidates at anywhere from 25 to 28%. McCain won about 28%, Romney about 25, maybe 26%, according to exit polls. But we were seeing that in our public opinion surveys as well.
Wow.
The surprise of everybody in 2016 that Latinos would support somebody like Donald Trump, who had made many comments about Mexican immigrants, particularly the country of Mexico, that were, to be light about it, not very positive. They were quite negative, nasty, in fact, as many folks might describe them, maybe even worse. Interestingly, that is, having had that narrative and what Trump did going into the 2016 election, people were surprised that any Hispanic would vote for Donald Trump. But as I said earlier, it's a diverse population. And even among Mexican Americans in the United States, who are usually third or higher generation, so their families have been here for a while, many of them think undocumented immigrants in the country should be deported. Not the majority, but it's not an insignificant number either. And our surveys have long shown a diversity of viewpoints, many viewpoints of which align with the views of the Republican Party. Another area, abortion. On abortion, Latinos haven't seen a shift in their viewpoints on this nationally in over 20 years of polling that we've been doing. But the U.S. public has generally become more the view that abortion should be legal, at least in some cases. But the Hispanic public is split evenly between legal or not legal, and it hasn't shifted on this point in the last few years. So Donald Trump was able to win enough of the Latino vote in a place like Florida, not just among Cubans, but also among Puerto Ricans who had recently moved to Florida from the island. I don't know if you know this or not, but about a third of adult Puerto Ricans on the island are evangelical Christian. So it doesn't have to be a majority, it just has to be enough to make a difference, and that's what we've been seeing happen nationally. But people were very surprised. And so I didn't see a surprise in that myself, but a lot of folks did, and I actually thought going into the 2016 election that there was something wrong with our surveys at Pew Research because we weren't picking up what everybody else was seeing. But as the evening rolled on, I realized we had picked up low intention to vote and some support for Trump that wasn't zero, but certainly not 50%. But at least it was something that was more than what most people were saying at the time.
Well, really interesting. Since you work in that area, and you know, the night of, your stuff is either legit or not, or like your stuff is valid or not. You know, and it's super. I mean, it's valid because y'all do it. But I mean, I guess when you see it, when you see it up against what is actually happening and taking place in the polls, right?
Yeah, in 2016, there was a pretty strong a narrative emerging among many, frankly, many Latino organizations that were boosting the Latino vote, talking about Latinos are angry because of everything that Trump said, and it just didn't quite seem to pan itself out. It was also a year, though, talking about get out the vote, where many foundations hadn't quite put in the same amount of money in 2016 for the Latino vote or immigrant vote than they had back in 2012. So it's also interesting that there were some other changes afoot that may have impacted turnout of Latinos.
I see. Okay, so we have a few questions here in the chat, actually. So Dr. Claudio Maldonado here asked, how many of the Latino voters in Florida are of Cuban descent? And I believe you hit on this thing.
Yeah, so about 30% of eligible voters in Florida are of Cuban origin, and about 29% are Puerto Rican. What's interesting is that back in 1980, half of Florida's Hispanic eligible voters were Cuban. So the Cuban share has been declining over the years, but it's also Cubans who are more likely to register to vote as Republicans, with the exception of Venezuelans. But it's been an interesting story because the Cuban vote in Florida has changed some. During the Obama years, it had turned majority Dem, so a majority of Cuban voters in Florida in 2008 and in 2012 supported Barack Obama, but in 2016, a majority supported Trump, 54%. So we're kind of been hovering at about that 54% level in terms of support for presidential candidates.
Mm-hmm. Well, and Dr. Lopez, you're really sitting in an interesting place because this is such an emerging population, and you're literally watching it change. I mean, in front of your eyes. I think it's very different from other populations, right? Other people who research different populations. So it's just really.
It's a great question, Marcos, and I think one of the things that, if I could have a moment, one of the things that I think is also interesting are the big trends that I describe as the big trends reshaping the nation's Latino population. So the population numbers 61 million people, and that number's been growing fast. And I want to say that U.S. population growth wouldn't be happening without Latinos. They've accounted for more than half of the nation's growth since 2000. So just keep that in mind. But we are seeing the following things happen. Immigration from Latin America has slowed sharply, particularly from Mexico. And while there may have been asylum seekers from Central America recently and Venezuela's outmigration as well, it is small by comparison to the numbers that we saw coming from Mexico in the 1990s and up to the mid-2000s. That, to me, is an important story to keep in mind because the share of the population that is born in another country has been falling. Today, only about 31% of U.S. Latinos were born in another country. It's now births to parents in the United States, U.S. births, that matter more for that population growth that I was talking about earlier.
Wow.
The second big trend is who's the fastest growing origin groups? Now, it used to be Mexicans who make up about 62% of the population now, but it's not anymore. It's Venezuelans, Dominicans, Guatemalans, Hondurans who are the fastest growing origin groups. So no surprise, I think, given the recent trends that we've seen. One other big trend that's happening is fertility rates among Hispanic women are declining. So that fast growth we were talking about is actually about half of what it used to be in the early 2000s. The Latino population was growing at a rate of about 4% a year on an annual basis. Now it's only growing at a rate of about 2%. the Asian population is actually growing faster on percentage terms than the Latino population. So it's no longer the fastest growing, but it's still a very important part of the story. And then finally, intermarriage rates are high among Latinos. And without an injection of immigrants from Latin America, what we're starting to see is the third generation, that is people who are U.S.-born, U.S.-born parents, are making up a growing share of the population, particularly among the youngest group. And that is translating into another trend, which is that identity is shifting. We see a growing number of people who say they have Hispanic ancestry but don't identify as part of the population, which is interesting. And English use is on the rise. And what I mean by that is a growing share, particularly among those under 18, speak only English. They don't speak any Spanish. So the population's changing as it gets more settled in the country and as immigration from Latin America slows so sharply.
Oh, I see. Man, thank you for those points. Excellent. Some of my the next questions we have here are, I believe you hit on this one. Do you see any difference between Latinos and Latinas when it comes to voting?
Absolutely. And this is something that's a trend that's emerging there's an emerging spread. First, Latinos turn out to vote at a higher rate than Latinos. So that is true of the general public.
Latinas
vote more than Latinos. Yes, so Hispanic women vote more than Hispanic men. And you see that generally speaking for women turning out to vote at a greater rate than men in the U.S. The difference isn't quite large yet. It's maybe about 3 percentage points in terms of the voter turnout rate. So like more than half of Hispanic women voted in 2016, but like maybe about 44% or so of Hispanic men turned out to vote. Mm-hmm. So that gives you some sense of the numbers. But we're also seeing a change in terms of how they identify their political party affiliations and how they feel about some policies as well. So Hispanic women are overwhelmingly, across all age groups, generations, they lean towards the Democratic Party very, very strongly. Like, over 70% of them will say they're Democrats, or 80% will say they're Democrats. Among men, though, the Democratic advantage is diminished. So the majority still say they're Democrats, but maybe only about 65% do. That's interesting because it shows that the pattern of Republican Party, Democratic Party identification that we see among the general public, whereas men tend to lean Republican, women tend to lean Democrat, it's happening among Latinos too. And it used to not be the case. Prior to Obama, that wasn't the case, but it's become more of a trend in the data as we've been tracking since Trump became president.
It amazes me how with each question you can just pull up all these statistics. It's really awesome. What did you say?
Don't go fact check me though.
No. So let's see. Do you see the alliances of young Latino voters shifting to what they currently are? Gracias. And this is from Dr. Rafael Fernandez Botran.
So alliances? I'm not sure alliances. You mean in terms of political party?
Allegiance. I'm sorry, it's allegiance, not alliances. Yeah. Do you see the allegiance of young Latino voters shifting to what they currently are? Gracias.
Yes, and this is something we've observed over the last 2 decades of polling at the Pew Research Center on Latinos. That is that Latinos, just like other young Americans, are leaning more towards the Democratic Party. So younger Latinos are more likely to be Democratic leaning than older Latinos. And you see this pattern even among Cuban Americans. Younger Cuban Americans are more Democrat leaning than older Cuban Americans. So it's a pattern that we see in the U.S. generally, and it's true among Latinos too.
Interesting. The other thing I wonder, or this is from Dr. Jose Fernandez, the other thing I wonder about is if the multi-generational Latin Americans has stopped identifying as Latinx, and does this affect the vote share meaningfully? Sorry.
Oh, that's a good question, Jose. So, a few years ago, we did a report looking at how many American adults will say they have a Hispanic ancestry, but won't self-identify as part of the population. They'll say, I'm not Hispanic, but I know that I have a grandmother that was Mexican. It turns out that's about 5 million U.S. adults. And the total number of Latino adults overall, people who self-identify as part of this, is about 35 million. So it's not an insignificant number, and it's probably growing because of intermarriage and the lack of new immigration. Will this have an impact on the Latino vote? Well, I don't think it's had an impact yet because there's just so many Latinos coming of age, and the population of eligible voters keeps growing and growing, and there's a growing number who actually turn out to vote. But I do wonder in the future what this will mean for the politics of everything from the Latino vote, if there is such a thing in the future, to also even the terms that people use to describe themselves. Will we see the term Hispanic, Latino, Latinx fade away as people identify in other ways that are recognizing their multitude of backgrounds, a Latino background and a non-Latino background? So we'll see what happens as things go forward around identity. But this is one of the areas that I'm really interested in because also, I don't know if you know this or not, Marcos, but did you know that 71% of Latino adults tell us that you don't have to speak Spanish to be considered Hispanic? And 84% say you don't have to have a Spanish surname to be considered Hispanic. And the reason why I bring those up is because if you've ever been in any of these parlor games, people oftentimes play this game of like, who's more Latino? I have the cred more than you do because I speak Spanish, or I'm darker skinned, or my family is from this. But here we are seeing a population of Latinos, particularly younger ones, who say that a lot of these markers that make you, or that people oftentimes have identified as things that make you Hispanic, are not necessarily seen as important anymore. So we'll see where identity goes.
Yeah. Man, super. It just gets more and more interesting around here. So let's see. The next question by Sandra Trejos is, what may have changed voters' views that change the percentage/preferences of political parties? And then the next question is, what is the role of religion and culture, for instance?
Sandra, thank you for the great question. Another trend that I didn't mention, but is an important one to note, is the changing religious affiliations of the U.S. Latino population. Back in 2009, about 2/3 of adults would say they affiliated with the Catholic Church. In our most recent survey in 2019.
Can you repeat that one about the Catholic Church? Sorry.
So back in 2009, we found that among Latino adults, 2/3 identified as Catholic or affiliated with the Catholic Church. In 2019, 10 years later, we found that actually only 47% affiliated with the Catholic Church. So the Catholic share among Latino adults is now below 50%. It's been steadily declining all this time. What's rising? It's not evangelical numbers. Their share has stayed about the same, which means that there's more Latinos who are evangelical just in numbers since the population has grown. But what has grown in share is unaffiliated or non-affiliated Latinos. These are oftentimes younger Latinos, and this is where you're seeing young Latinos look like other young Americans. They tend to be unaffiliated, they tend to go to college, they tend to be Democrat-leaning, and all those things are coming together, and you're seeing that happening among young Latinos. But in terms of the other preferences, when it comes to male-female differences, one of the things there I think that's happening is issues around immigration, around abortion, and that those issues are where we see some divisions between men and women among Hispanics that have gotten a little wider in recent years and may be affecting their views of the parties and which party they support. But I would stress that the share that have voted Republican in presidential campaigns or presidential election years, frankly, hasn't changed much. And so I don't think we've had a real movement of party like folks talk about with regards to Latinos. And I think that's because, again, it's a diverse population. It's not like Black Americans who tend to vote towards the Democratic Party at a rate of about 95% or more in elections. Latinos have always been a group that, well, depending on the candidate, will vote different ways. And if you remember, George Bush in 2004 won 44% of the Latino vote, at least 40%. But the exit poll put him at 44%.
I see. And then one more here from Dr. Claudio Maldonado. Is there a large number of Latinos that identify as libertarian?
No, not a large number. They either identify as part of the Democratic Party, which is what you see most, the largest number do, or the Republican Party. There are some who will say they're independent, but they tend to lean towards those two parties. Not a lot of libertarian or third party voters.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so I think with that, you all, please any more questions, yeah, please drop them in there. I'll just say, in the meantime, while people do that, if there are any more questions, I think it's a really exciting time, especially when we talk about identity, right, and identity development. You mentioned how it just makes me excited as to, the emergent identities that are going to be, that are going to be created, or that, that are yet to, or fully take root. I wonder, like, what are some of the identities that you see taken more? What are some emerging ones that you feel will take the front lane as we move forward?
So I noticed that in my introduction and in the advertisements for today's event, you had Hispanic Latinx is how you refer to the population. We just did a survey of the population of people who self-identify as part of the Hispanic, Latino, Latinx population. And we asked them, have you ever heard of the term Latinx? And note that I'm saying, are they aware of it or not? Have they just heard of it? Not do they like it or not, just have they heard of it? And we found that 3/4 had not heard of the term Latinx. Mm-hmm. And so we asked those who did hear about it, do you use it to describe yourself? And when you take the share who said that the number who said that they do, and then put it over the entire adult population of Latinos, only 3% of Latino adults in the United States say that they use the term Latinx to describe themselves. We went on to ask if you had to pick one of 3 terms to identify the population, Hispanic, Latino, or Latinx, or maybe even something else, which one would you choose? 61% said Hispanic. Another 39% or so said Latino. Just 4% said Latinx. I'm sorry, those numbers don't add up. 35% Latino. So that is a very, very interesting set of findings because, as you know, Latinx has grown in popularity, particularly on college campuses. News media is using it more and more. I've been doing a lot of presentations in the last year to newsrooms who have been asking about the choice, about the editorial choice of, should I use Hispanic? Should I use Latino? Should I use Latinx? What should I use? And many have decided to use Latinx to be inclusive. You see many celebrities using it, corporations making statements about it, and yet the population it's meant to describe, at least right now, is unfamiliar with it. So you asked me, what's to come? I think that Latinx is probably going to rise in popularity because it was on the uptick already. Just not a lot of people just don't know about it. But I think that there may even be new terms that emerge in the future that will supplant Latinx. And I think this is one of the most interesting things about living in this country is that the things we do to describe ourselves and how we identify changes over time. And that's an exciting thing to watch and study. But I know that it also can be something that many people get very, very worked up over or very, very strict about or engage you in really tough ways if you don't use the right term to even describe yourself.
Right. I actually had a student, the term Latinx always opens up a big bucket of worms for some good discussion. And I actually sat with the student today and explained, what was actually meant by that term. So yeah, it is. And I find myself doing that at least once a month. If not more, with where I'm at, and going to presenting, in the different parts of campus and even outside in community. So,
yeah, your experience is a lot like mine. I hear a lot of questions about it and from many different sources. And of course, I don't know if any of the folks who you've talked to about Latinx have also mentioned the emerging term in Latin America as an alternative, which is Latin with an E. So Latine.
Yeah.
And that addresses one of the criticisms of Latinx, which is that it doesn't work in Spanish very well. I mean, I don't know how you pronounce, there's not a lot of words with an X in it in Spanish, but you could say todos, todas, todes, it works. And so that is interesting that that's emerged. But, I think that the country is changing when it comes to identity, and there's more acceptance of conversations around letting people choose to describe themselves how they want to. So for example, pronouns that people prefer and telling you about their pronouns that they prefer. That's an example of being inclusive and a new movement that many young people, including young Latinos, say that they support or that they're aware of, and that older Americans are not. But around the world, there's a real movement to have a gender-neutral form of words in many different languages, not just Spanish and not just in English.
Oh yeah, that's awesome that you have that perspective, because yeah, you do global research as well. So that's really interesting to see and encouraging, because language, as what, the student that brought the term Latinx to me, one of the things that they said was like, it's language, you can't change language. And that's where I challenged them. I was like, who do you think created Spanish? Like, it was people, and like it can be fluid, right? And that was one of my challenges to them. It's like, not the shoe isn't going to fit exactly how it comes. You may have to customize it, or suggest some new things, and I think that's as we emerge in our identities, I think it demands for us to be fluid and accepting of what the new stuff that is emerging.
That's right. It's a great point, and I do think that's right. These are changing and emerging, and that's the exciting part about it.
Right. So with that, let's see. There's a few other. Okay, I see you posted. You can sign up for our newsletter. Yes, you also www.pewhispanic.org. And then how can we follow these statistics from Dr. Fernandez? And then how about voting preference by levels of education? Anything on that?
Yeah, so among Latino voters, those who are college educated or higher tend to lean more towards the Democratic Party than those who are, say, high school graduates versus those who, say, have less than a high school diploma. But it's not that sharp of a gradient or of a difference as you see among the general U.S. public, because many of those who are have less than a high school education are also naturalized U.S. immigrants, and they tend to lean very heavily towards the Democratic Party. So it's largely the same across all the different education levels, though again, I think one of the bigger stories is really about differences by origin groups, whereas I mentioned earlier, Cubans and Venezuelans tend to lean towards the Republican Party, and then Mexicans and Puerto Ricans and Dominicans tend to be much more toward the Salvadoreños, towards the Democratic Party.
Super interesting. It looks like James Flynn came in with something. How often we use hermanos, but they may not serve today? How often we use hermanos, but that may not serve today? Dr. Jim Flynn, or Father Jim Flynn. Can you say more about that, Padre? Padre Viva, I believe that's you in there. I'm not sure.
Sure.
But
so often in a church, especially, we say hermanos. And many people accept that as both male and female, but could that be corrected in today's ambiance?
Oh, that's a good question. Yes, I think it could be. It's certainly not my role to say that it should be or what it might be, but I wouldn't be surprised if you start to see people think of alternatives to hermanos in that setting.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, I mean, hermanos right off the bat would be some. I mean, you'd get looked at weird for the next 10 years, but the next 15 years probably until it really hits. But, yep.
Yeah. Hermanos y hermanas. Los dos.
That's right.
Los dos también, yeah, Yep. But yeah, the gender neutral hermanes we kind of slice those. But yeah, I mean, I see that there's people in community who just go down the list and say, buenos días todas, todes, todos. So I mean.
Oh, sure. Yeah, that's another way to do it. I do wonder, Father, whether or not making these sorts of changes for those who are regulars at church, they might be largely a foreign-born or immigrant parish, and it's particularly among immigrants where we see a lot of question marks about the use of Latinx. Like, why are we doing this? This doesn't work in Spanish. So I do wonder if changing hermanos to hermanes would work in that environment, but I don't know. You would know that better than I would, and it's best to just ask if people want to try it.
And I think I think that highlights how we started this conversation, Dr. Lopez, and how you said, I think context is everything, right? And you said, you know, I am Hispanic if I am, I think it was Texas, or yes, I think it was, and then Latinx if I'm in DC.
Yeah.
So, you know, being able, knowing your audience is of course, like that's one thing that I honestly didn't expect to see from you. I thought it was going to be just like very specific, either Hispanic or Latino, Latinx, or, you know, but it was awesome to see that you were like, that it was fluid, you know. I was like, I love that.
I try to let people also talk to then hear what they're using, and then I will adjust accordingly. Now that makes me a chameleon, you know, so, but I also find that sometimes in doing a presentation like this, if I use a term that folks might find troubling, it immediately leads to questions that derail the entire presentation. So that's part of the reason why I make those adjustments. But another adjustment that I make in Texas is I say that I'm Mexican American as opposed to Chicano. And in someplace, like if I'm traveling outside the country, like if I'm in Europe or even if I'm in Mexico, I will say that I'm American because I am from this country. I was born here, and I may be of Hispanic heritage, but I find that in Europe, if you say you're Mexican, they're like, what? But you got an American passport. Like, but I'm Mexican origin. It's just like, it's hard to explain. Yeah. But one of the interesting things that happened to me in Spain on a recent trip was I gave a presentation, and one of the first questions, it was about identity in the United States among this population. And the first question I got was, how come you don't consider us Hispanic? I mean, we're Spain. So I thought that was a very interesting question, which tells you something about what many people from the United States of Hispanic or Latino background have said to those when they go to Spain and to Spaniards talking about identity. And as you know, Latino is not meant to be inclusive of Spain as a definition.
At all. Yeah. No. And yeah, and that gets even tough, right, with Brazil and speaking Portuguese, and how, you know, being Latino has to do with speaking Spanish. And yeah, and I mean, it's it gets like complex, you know. So yeah. With that, you all, Dr. Lopez, any last closing words that, you know?
No, other than it's been a real pleasure. And if you have any questions or anything at all that you would like to follow up with me on, I'm more than happy to answer any questions. I know that Jose has my contact information, and would be happy to engage. So thank you for the opportunity to be here today.
100%. So thank you so much again, Dr. Lopez, here on behalf of the Hispanic Latinx Faculty and Staff Association at U of L. Really appreciate it. And so it's been a great conversation. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. This concludes our presentation.
Okay. Bye, you all. Que pasen buenas noches. Catch y'all later.
Adios. Goodbye, everybody. Adios.
Adios. Hasta luego.
Adios. Hasta luego.
Ciao.
Bye.